Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and in today's video we're going to talk about truth and belief. The first thing we're going to talk about is that when you believe something, you're asserting an attitude about a proposition. So if you believe that water is wet, then you are asserting the attitude that it is true that water is wet, such that, you know, making a statement is the same as making the statement that that thing is true, or specifically, water is wet is equal to it is true that water is wet, right? And the reason that it's good that we really lay that out when it comes to beliefs and when it comes to knowledge is because sometimes people may state something but not necessarily mean that that thing is true, right? So when we come to say that we know something, we've got to make sure that we're getting there in the proper way, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to go through some examples of truth claims. They're in the assorteric form. That means they're making a claim that X is true, right? And there's three different kinds. There's non-contextual, there's context relative, and then there's implicitly speaker relative. Each of these deal with truth in a certain way, and we're going to see that as we go through them. So first we've got a non-contextual, such as water is wet. The Earth is the third planet from the sun. The moon is smaller than the Earth, right? These things, regardless who the speaker is or regardless of what context they're spoken in, are always true or always false, depending on the statement you're making. But now we've got context relative, right? That depends on the context you're in. So the example is, it's raining here, right? Here right now in Kentucky, it's not raining, but it could be raining in Chicago, right? It could be raining tomorrow. It could have rained yesterday, right? It's specific to the context in which we're talking. Next, we've got implicitly speaker relative statements. So those depend on the speaker. So for example, if someone says algebra is hard, what they're really saying is, it is true for me that algebra is hard, right? The context is related to the speaker. Now, it can be the case that implicitly speaker relative and context relative statements might mix and match, and sometimes it can be hard to tell, where one ends and where the other begins. But that's why it's important that we remember that a statement is the same as asserting that it's true, that that statement is true, right? So water is H2O is the same as it is true water is H2O. It's raining here is the same as it is true that it's raining here. Or algebra is hard would be translated to, it is true that for me algebra is hard, right? So that's why we have to understand that beliefs are attitudes towards propositions, and that asserting it is to claim that it's true. And then we also have to remember that there are different ways that people can make statements about topics. One thing that people might do when they are debating with you or when they're talking to you is they might say something like, that might be true for you, or that's just your opinion. And if someone makes a statement like that, they're basically shutting down any possible future argument. If someone says that to you, they're basically refusing to dialogue. So there's no point in continuing any further because they basically shut you down. One thing that I will note is that some people will use this to argue that the truth is relative. So someone might say that all truth just depends on who's saying it or something of that nature. That's internally incoherent, just because they're making a statement about truth, but that statement on truth depends on truth being non-relative, right? So that means that truth must be objective and independent of persons, which leads us to our next part, which is moral relativism. Moral relativists believe that all moral statements are essentially value statements, are essentially statements of how you feel about something. Now, moral relativism can be a consistent type of argument, but the consequences of it are just ghastly, So for example, if someone says that right and wrong are just dependent on a culture. Well, what about a culture that practices human sacrifice or practices things such as burying young children alive if they don't like the food that their parents serve them, right? Like, I mean, that's horrible. And to, go through and say, well, that's their culture and they're the ones that decide what is right or wrong, it is shocking to the conscience, but it can be made into a consistent argument. So if a person is to accept moral relativism, then they have to be willing to accept the consequences that come with that. If we are to accept that there is a such thing as moral progress, or that society can get better, or that things can improve, then it can't be the case that moral relativism is true. Moral relativism cannot be true, and it also be true that we can improve the lives of people through moral means, through things such as legislative changes, or through things such as cultural practices or whatever. Because if moral relativism is true, then there's no need to do any of those things, because any group of people that gets together will just decide what is right or wrong. Additionally, when someone argues from a moral relativist standpoint, they're basically putting moral claims outside of the realm of critical thinking. They're basically shutting it off to any argument, which, as we can kind of guess from the progress of human society, is not a good thing, right? Science has advanced because people continue to debate and argue and perform experiments and try things out to find the truth. And morality is the same way. We can't just shut it down and say that's a cultural practice, or that's just their idea of right and wrong, so that's just the way it is. Next, we'll talk about scientific theories. Now, we got to remember, scientific theories aren't just like a series of wild guesses. It's not just throwing stuff together and hoping something is true. It is structuring arguments or structuring truthful premises together in such a way that it can explain some phenomenon, right? And additionally, most scientific theories are testable, meaning that you can repeat the results over time, which adds extra credibility to it. And that credibility hopefully provides us with justification on whether or not to believe what the theory is presenting us. Now, when we're presented with an argument, there's 4 things we can do. We can believe it. We can not believe it. We can suspend judgment, or we can not engage, right? So if someone says to you the sky is blue, very likely you could believe it. If they tell you it's raining cheese, might not believe it. If they tell you that the price of land in China is very cheap, you might suspend judgment. Maybe you don't know, right? You want to investigate some more before you decide whether to believe it or not. And, if they tell you that apple pie is the best, you might not engage. You might just walk away, right? Because you want to make sure that you are justified in your belief, right? Because our belief is justified if we have a good reason. And there's a few ways that we can have good reason. For example, perception and introspection, right? If you say that you are hungry, well, you could be justified in that belief by, thinking and being like, oh, well, I'm hungry. If you say the sky is blue, you can be justified in that belief by looking outside and seeing the sky is blue, right? Of course, justification can fail to be rationally persuasive. And a mistaken justification is an irrational belief, which leads us to internal versus externalism. Internalism versus externalism. So part of the problem with justifying our beliefs is that we have to know we're in the right conditions to know those beliefs. We have to know that we can know the things in the right way. We have to know we're not being deceived, and we have to know that what we're seeing is actually true. So an internalist would believe that we can't know something is true unless, for example, we know the conditions are true. For example, we know we're not being deceived. So when you think about the Iraq War, we invaded Iraq under the false belief that they had weapons of mass destruction, right? We felt we were justified in our belief because the evidence painted a certain picture to us. However, it turned out that we were being deceived and that Saddam Hussein was just posturing as if he had weapons of mass destruction. So an internalist would say that we couldn't have been justified in our belief before because we didn't know we were being deceived. But that sets a really high bar, because in any given situation, can you know you're not being deceived? Can you know that what you're seeing is truthful and accurate, right? The opposite to the internalist is the externalist. They say that you can know something even if you don't know the conditions about it. You can know that the sky is blue even if you don't know what it looks like outside, right? Or even if you don't know whether or not you're being deceived. Additionally, when it comes to justification, probability plays a pretty large role. Things that are more probable are easier for us to justify. Say you have a cat, and very frequently you see your cat laying on the floor. If someone says your cat's laying on the floor, there's a pretty high probability that's true, right? But if you don't have a cat and someone says that, well, that's odd, right? Because what's the probability that a cat has snuck into your house and is laying on the floor, right? So probability, the likelihood of something occurring, does have an effect on whether or not we can justify belief in it. Which leads us to knowledge, right? Because knowledge is a justified true belief. So let's go through the tripartite theory of knowledge and the components that are required for us to know something. So for something to be true, it has to be the case that you have to believe that it's true. S believes P. It has to be true. And we have to be justified to believe it, right? So for us to know something, we have to believe it, it has to be true, and we have to be justified to believe it. And that's where the debate between internalism and externalism comes in, right? Because how do we know if we're justified to believe something? It could be that we're being deceived, right? We could be living in the matrix, right? Perhaps none of the things that we think are true are actually true, right? We could be a brain in a vat, right? Perhaps none of the stuff we're experiencing is actually the truth, right? So when it comes to this tripartite theory of knowledge, we have to keep in mind where the problems are. When it comes to believing something, well, there's not a lot of debate about that. You either believe it or you don't. As far as it being true, it's either true or it's not. But where it starts running into problems is with the justification. We have to keep that in mind when it comes to knowledge, because we might be in situations where we have to try and determine whether or not something is the case or whether or not we believe something purely on speculation or with incomplete data, and we need to know how to operate in that kind of environment. Now, when it comes to the foundation of our knowledge and when it comes to how our knowledge relates to itself and to the world, there are two main thoughts. There is foundationalism and coherentism. Foundationalism says that for our knowledge to be true, there has to be a bedrock set of beliefs on which all other beliefs depend, such as the law of non-contradiction. You know, A can't be true and false at the same time, right? It has to be one or the other. That's a foundational belief. But we have coherentism, which says that, you know, there's no need for foundational beliefs. It just has to be the case that ideas overlap and interlock with each other to create a web of beliefs. Foundationalism is pretty strong because we can turn to our perceptions and we can say, okay, I know that it is warm because I can feel the warmth of the sun, right? That's a foundational belief. But coherentism comes in and says, hey, some of these things that we might claim to know, we don't actually know, because it is the case that our perceptions can be faulty or our knowledge can be faulty somewhere along the line. So therefore, we have to have ways for our knowledge to interact with itself and with the world in which we aren't building upon a faulty belief. But let me know what you think. If you're one of the students in my class, what do you think about knowledge and justified true belief? I can't wait to see your comments in the forums, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts during the weekly meetings. If you're someone who's come across this video on YouTube, I really appreciate you sticking around to the end, and I hope that you learned something. Leave it down below and let me know what you think. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.